What's up everybody? Today we're going to be going over my waterfall editing process. We're going to start in Lightroom, all the basic adjustments that we do there. Take it on into Photoshop for the masking, dodging and burning, ordinate effect, all that good stuff that we do in Photoshop. Bring it back into Lightroom for the finishing adjustments, and I'll show you my process of how I do this. I'm going to be speeding through any of the basic adjustments. You can watch some of my other tutorials if you want an in-depth step-by-step view on how I do these individual things. But for the purpose of making this tutorial short and to the point, I'm going to skip through that. We're going to be going over 3 images today, some that require more editing than others, but it's going to kind of give you an overview of my waterfall editing process. So let's hop into Lightroom and get started. So for this tutorial, you're going to need obviously a copy of Lightroom, Photoshop, a Wacom tablet helps with the dodging and burning and the masking, and that is about it. So let's take a look at our images here. I'm going to show you the final images of all 3 to show you what we're working towards, and then I'll kind of give you a little quick overview of what we will be doing to achieve them. So here we have Spirit Falls. This is over in the Columbia River Gorge. We got a nice long expo. I believe the original long expo here was 30 seconds. I usually shoot brackets. And then this is actually a 1/6 of a second shot that I used for all these leaves and trees and things that could move that I do not want blurry in the final image. So if we look at the final image, everything is pretty crisp. Anything that's sort of blurry is ordinate effect that I applied in post. Looking nice. So basically what I did here was I edited the main image for everything out here and then masked in the water over the water of this shot. And then obviously some colors and dodging and burning and all that stuff. Next up we have Toketee Falls. This is over in the Umpqua National Forest. This image, you can see there's a strong shadow here, so there's definitely a lot of masking done here to bring back this, because in the original brackets you can see it's pretty much pitch black, and it was sort of harsh light. The sun was setting. It was probably 3 hours from sunset, so we don't have the golden light, but it was definitely harsh, and luckily I have this split with the waterfall in the middle here, the dark and the light, and I kind of like that for the composition, and we have the this log and this rock. So kind of the same deal in this image. I'll show you the long expo. It is a 5-second f8, and pretty much that's just for the water. And I believe I use Raya Pro to bring back the shadows from here, and probably use this one as my middle composition, and that was just for this area over here in the rocks. Nothing much going on with the sky, so you can see that I just cropped it out for the most part. Blue skies, nothing special there. And then all the basic adjustments done in Lightroom, of course. Our final image here is Tumalo Falls, also in Oregon. And it was sort of a cloudy day. So cloudy days are pretty good for waterfall photography. It's not direct sunlight, but you know, golden light would be nice. But a cloudy day is better than just blue skies with harsh light, because it gives you a little bit to work with, especially with the dodging and burning. And I believe this image was a single image, which sometimes you don't necessarily have to take a separate image for the leaves and stuff. You can see there's some blurriness in the leaves here. It didn't bother me that much to the point at which I would take a second exposure. And I believe I was dealing with a lot of water vapor because of the wind and because this is a rather large waterfall. So I'm not sure if I took a separate exposure just for this. But either way, this is our single exposure here, and we didn't have to do any focus stacking either because the rocks were pretty far away from where I was. And we got our leading line here, and then everything is sharp back here. So it was pretty much a single image edit at 2.5 seconds f8, 14 millimeter. So these are our 3 images. 3, 2, 1. We'll go ahead and start in the order that they're in. So we'll start with this one from Spirit Falls. I usually start on whatever the medium exposure image would be, because that way you can get a good idea for the white balance. So I'm going to speed through this. I'm not going to narrate it, but basically white balance, highlights, shadows, just get a nice clean, even image. Maybe do something with the calibration. But I'm going to speed through this and I'll let you know when I get to the next point. Alright, so we have our basic adjustments here. You can see this one, I had to bring up the exposure way up here, and we're getting a lot of noise in these areas, which normally would be a problem, but since we're only really using it for the water, it should be fine. There's a little bit of color noise here, but we can fix that. And for the most part, this looks good, matches this one pretty well. I'm going in a slightly different direction with the white balance and the greens because just stylistic choice. I did a second edit of a similar photo and I liked it a lot better with a little bit less green and a little bit more orangey yellow kind of a look, because the green can kind of be overwhelming, you know, and especially if you start bumping up the saturation and the contrast, it looks a little too much. I like this kind of a brown, orange, and a little bit of green or yellow tones in this image. So what we're going to do now is take both of these images here and see they shift a little bit. Maybe the tripod moved, maybe something moved, but we can easily align those in Photoshop. So we're going to take these two, make sure you have them both selected, then go to Edit, Open as Layers in Photoshop. So same thing here. I'm going to speed through anything that I've covered in a previous tutorial. I'll put links, of course, at the end for the tutorials that relate to what I'm doing here. But first thing I'm going to do here is align the images. Make sure my base image is at the bottom, the long expo on top. Have them both selected. Go to Edit, Auto Align Images or Layers, and that'll usually affect the top one to make it match the bottom one. There we go. You can see it was probably zoomed in a little bit, or maybe I touched the lens. But anyways, so we have these two lined up. The first thing we're going to do is mask in the water onto our base image, and then from there we'll do the dodging and burning, any object removal and Orton blur effect that we need to do to finish this image up. Just do a quick back and forth, see where the lines are. I'm mostly going to be covering these white water areas. Anything here, this doesn't seem to be a lot of water movement, and plus there's a lot of noise here, so I'm going to ignore those areas, pretty much focus on these areas. This is where the Wacom tablet comes into play. I'm just going to have to be careful a little bit because there's some branches overhanging on this area, which they do move in the final image, so just going to have to go and be careful in these areas. So I'll break out the Wacom tablet and get to masking. And just because I'm going to be speeding through it, what you want to do is click your layer that you want to mask, Alt, and then create mask, and that will mask the whole thing out. Then you get your brush here, you know, adjust your size, of course. I usually do something around 33%. When I'm doing a hard masking, if I'm dodging and burning, I usually do something around 16% opacity, but 30% because I know pretty much exactly what I'm going to be painting in. Make sure you have the white selected because the masking out area is all black, and then we get to painting. So one thing you can do after you're somewhat done masking, or you think you're done, is hide the base layer under it, and then you can actually see the areas that you have masked, and you can see there's all these gaps here that I'm going to quickly fill in. So one thing you'll notice is that those leaves that I mentioned on the branch that is hanging over the waterfall back here, part of them are still blurry. So for the purpose of this tutorial, I'm not really gonna worry about that too much, but just so you have an idea of what you could do if you're trying to get these things perfect and you have more time, is you take the quick selection tool and you start selecting around this area on the waterfall. And with Alt-click, you can deselect the green leaves here and just kind of get most of this waterfall area. The quick selection tool sort of learns what you're trying to select. And then let's say that's your rough selection. and make sure you have your base layer selected here. Okay, so once you have your rough selection done, you click the select and mask, and you click on this one over here. This brush is called the Refine brush, I believe. Well, it's not loading, but you make sure you have Smart Radius to about 3, and then you start painting around here, and it'll recognize what you want to select and what you don't. And you can see all the red is what is being selected, and it is pretty much getting the white part of the waterfall. And for the most part, it's ignoring the leaves. Sometimes you have to sort of go over this again with the main quick selection brush, and it'll sort of learn what you're trying to select. But you get the idea. Then I usually shift the edge a little bit to expand the selected area, and then feather it out 0.5. And once you have that selected, you can go back into your mask and make sure you have the white, and then you can further refine this and not worry too much about making the leaves blurry. And then what you can do is just go to select, inverse, get the black, and now it has the opposite selected, and you can bring back those leaves. And that was pretty much a quick job of it, but you get the idea. If you want to get these little areas in the leaves, it kind of helps with that. So anyways, we have our mask done here. And as you can see, I avoided all this area and really just got the movement of the water here. And you know what? Some of this texture in the water, it doesn't really bother me too much. Maybe I did too long of an exposure, but another thing you can do is just reduce the opacity a little bit of your water layer here, and that way we bring back just a little bit of this texture. Really helps, because otherwise you have like this milky blob here, and it's not the most appealing. We can shape that with the dodging and burning, but just to have a little bit of texture, I want to actually reduce the opacity to about half, and that way it's a mix of a long exposure and that 0.5 second exposure that I had, I believe. So from here, I'm going to combine these layers, go to Merge Visible. That way we have our nice base layer here. Make sure you save. And then before I do the dodging and burning, I like to do object removal. So anything that's like poking out here, I'll get rid of real quick. Maybe just this little branch here. There's nothing too much in this shot. But I'll do that real quick, and then I'll get into the dodging and burning. When I do the dodging and burning, I'm mostly going to be creating an artificial vignette by burning anything outside over here on the outside of the frame and drawing your attention here. And then I'm going to shape some of this waterfall, just burn a few lines in here and just make it a little bit more textured and more of a leading line up to this area here. So for the dodging and burning, I duplicate the layer. This is all in the tutorial that I've done, a few tutorials that I've done. Then you probably start with the burning here. Bring down the curves, Alt, create new mask, and then start painting that in. Okay, so I went pretty quick on the dodging and burning, just for the purpose of the tutorial. You can see I brightened at the end this area here. I'm going to create a radial filter over in Lightroom with some negative clarity, and I'm going to make it seem as if there's like a sun or a sunbeam sort of shining in this area, because that's sort of the focal point. Your eye kind of goes from down here all the way up to the your eye kind of goes from down here all the way up to these two waterfalls up in this area. Might crop this a little tighter, get rid of all this since this is not really important to the composition, maybe right to the edge of that rock there. And after this, I'm going to combine these layers. I'm probably going to get rid of this little bush here too. combine these layers and do the final Orton blur effect, which will pretty much only be in this area up here, and then a little bit on the waterfall, and anywhere where I see a little potential for where light would be hitting, and just creates a little bit more of that dreamy look. This is also covered in some of my other tutorials. So the Orton blur is sort of a base layer, which I'll add a little bit more negative clarity in when I take it back to Lightroom, and this will accentuate pretty much just these areas where I already added that Orton blur effect. And so you don't want to overdo it too much here. Looks pretty good as is. But we're pretty much done here. I'm going to do that cropping I mentioned, get rid of this little bush, and then bring this back into Lightroom. So back in Lightroom, we can see, let's compare it to our base image here. Added that long expo masked in water, and a little bit of dodging and burning, not too much done to it. In this final image, you can see it was a completely different color tone. You know, your style changes over time, and although this wasn't that long ago, it looks a little too blue to me. Yeah, I would definitely, in hindsight, maybe bring out the reds a little bit more, just so you have more going on than just the blue and the green. But it is what it is. So we have our image over here. And let's start off by just doing a little exposure adjustment, the negative clarity. And then what we're going to do here is zoom out so I can drop the radial filter that I mentioned on top, invert that, bring the exposure up. Sometimes you can play with the feathering a little bit, and you want it just out of the frame. Sometimes it works if you add a little bit of warmth to it, and make it a little bit bigger, and then you can just kind of see at what point do you need it in here. That looks good to me. Zoom back in, a little before and after, how it's coming along. Now we want to add our contrast back with the tone curve. Raise the blacks just a tiny bit. And sometimes when you add the contrast, you get a little too much saturation, so I like to bring that down just a little bit to compensate. And then final step here is to add the vignette. And you can create a range mask so that you don't darken the already dark areas. You might add another radial filter here, just to emphasize our focal point. And you don't want to brighten the bright areas to overexpose it. You just want to make it a little bit more of like a spotlight. Maybe something like that, and that way this is all darker and it kind of brings your eye up to that brighter area. So I'm happy with that. The final adjustment after the vignette is usually just to add the sharpening. Hold Alt on the masking, make sure you're only getting kind of the outlines of the areas that you want to get here. Zoom in, I usually have that at about 60 364, radius 1.4. You can see it adds just a little bit more sharpness because we did all that negative clarity. There's our image, completely different from this one. I believe there might be a little bit of split toning going on. So let's actually do a little split toning. Very light adjustment here. I'm not sure that it adds that much, but yeah, we ended up with a completely different image here. But you get the idea as far as masking in the long exposure water. Let's move on to our second image, which is Toketi Falls over here. So what we're going to do is find our base layer. So this is obviously the overexposed, this is the middle, and this is the long exposure. So let's start with our middle exposure here. And as I did previously, I'm going to quickly go through all this and then bring it back up to speed as we bring it into Photoshop. So the same thing as the previous image, this one is pretty much going to be just masked in for the water. There's a little bit of blurriness here that'll give us a little trouble while we're painting in the mask, but for the most part, it's not a lot of branches over the water. And this log here is actually moving in the long expo. So I'm also going to be taking that log from this image and looking at it real closely. The focus is off on the log here, but it's a little bit sharper on the rock. So I believe I focused for the rock, and then all this got into focus because it's pretty far from the camera. In hindsight, I should have done a little focus bracket, separate bracket for this, and I probably have one somewhere in the files, but don't feel like going digging for it. So we have everything all synced up here as far as white balance. You can see there's noise in the shadows here, but we're going to be taking the shadows from this one and combining that with Raya Pro. So let's select all our layers, right click, edit in, open as layers in Photoshop. So we're going to deal with our long exposure layer here last. Well, not last, but second to last. First thing I want to do is have a nice even exposure on our base layer. I covered this step in on a few of my previous tutorials, how to use Raya Pro, but you basically, I'm going to speed through it, but you basically place your either brighter or darker layer depending on what you're trying to do. You go into your panels, which I don't believe it's visible here. Here it is. And then you go to precision masking, and Raya Pro will analyze the image and select what whether you're trying to darken or brighten. It'll select what areas needs to be masked into the underlying layer and basically do all the heavy lifting for you. So it looks like because of the difference in exposure, Raya Pro it does its job, but sometimes it makes this very HDR kind of effect because it's bringing in so much of the data from the bright exposure into the dark exposure. So there's going to be a little bit of tweaking I need to do here, but I'm basically going to select this one and paint out anything that I don't want included in this mask, because all it did was create a mask for us. So I'm going to speed through that also. So what I ended up doing was painting out the mask on every other area except for this shadow area, and then I actually painted more of the mask in here to get it more even because it had that sort of HDR kind of look, and then just reduce the opacity because this is too much recovery of that shadow, and we still want it to be a shadow, which is what it originally was. You just want to see what is there. And then I'm going to adjust it further in the dodging and burning, but something around here is good enough. because when you have too flat of an image, that's where it gets that HDR look and just doesn't look real at all. So once we have our base exposure and our long exposure, you can see there's a little bit of an alignment issue. The tripod was in the water, so that's no surprise. So we'll just go ahead and auto align those layers. And that works right there. And the same as we did with the previous image, I'm just going to mask out the long exposure, and I'm just going to paint in anywhere in the water here and the waterfall, of course. And then, as I mentioned, I'm going to avoid the log here because it was moving in the long exposure. And let's go ahead and speed through that real quick. And just like the other image, you can hide the bottom layer and see your mask here, see where you're still missing some spots to paint in. Okay, so we have our long exposure water masked in. There's a little bit of blurriness on these leaves over here. I could probably just Content Aware fill them out. We'll see how that turns out, but anyways, I'm going to go ahead and combine this layer. Now I'll go ahead with the removal of any distracting elements. Okay, so that's good enough. I would mess with that a little bit more if I was making a final image, but for the tutorial, that's fine. As far as the crop, let's see what we had originally here. So it's not exactly a 4x5, but I believe it is a little bit smaller than a 16x9. No, it's a little, yeah, actually it is. So it's a little bit wider than a 16x9. What I'll usually do is I'll have something that is close to a 4x5. I mean, honestly, there's not much going on up here with the that little blue sky, but a 4x5 might be a little bit too tight. I mean, it completely removes the sky and puts your focus completely on the waterfall. I actually kind of like that. Like, I would probably do something like this where you see a little bit of sky, but the waterfall is obviously the main focus. But anyways, there must have been a method to my madness. But let's do that for this one actually. So we're not going to set a set ratio. We're just going to have something like this. And then I had the waterfall on the thirds line, and there's really nothing to include, nothing important in the bottom here. I do want to have a little bit of gap between this white water and the bottom of the frame. So something like this. Waterfall falls on the rule of thirds point over here. This is our leading line going up to it. And then zoom out, see what it looks like on an Instagram grid. So this is our crop right here. And the final things that need to be done are the dodging and burning. I'm going to darken this shadow area over here, probably desaturate it when I take it back into Lightroom. You can see I removed that the cave over here, which was also removed in this one. Actually, that's similar line where I cut it. There's a little bit more down here. I'm going to dodge and burn, maybe darken the water, burn the water, dodge a little bit of the white areas, and maybe a little bit over here, just to emphasize the leading line. Okay, so that looks pretty good for the dodging and burning. You can see I burned this area a little bit more just because it was so bright and green. I'm going to have to desaturate that for sure. And then I dodged these white areas, and I actually dodged and burned a few little lines here to accentuate the lines of the waterfall. And I believe in the original photo back here, I did a little bit more burning on the basalt shadows, but for the tutorial I don't really need to go into that deep of a detail here. So I'm going to combine these layers and then do the final Orton blur effect. And as with the last image, Orton blur will mostly go on to the long exposure water over here, and maybe a little bit on these bright areas where the light is hitting. Just have to be careful not to overdo it. Alright, so that looks pretty good for the Orton blur. Go ahead and merge those layers and bring this back into Lightroom. So looking at our comparison image here, I definitely burned the water a lot more. You can see it's a lot brighter here. You know, that's how things go. I also removed these little bit of branches that were sticking up in the frame here. And what else? Obviously the crop is a little bit different, but we still got a few more adjustments to do here. So we're going to bring down the highlights, add some contrast, and the usual finishing touches. So that looks pretty good. Let's look at our original base image here. The water obviously was not long exposed. Everything else kind of, you know, looking okay, but this one is a lot better. We got our long exposure water, a little bit of detail in the shadow, but it's still a shadow. Comparing to this one, you can see the color balance is a little bit more blue or green. I played with the calibration at the end on this one, but pretty much a similar looking image. So pretty satisfied with that, and that's what you can achieve with masking in a long exposure water and a regularly exposed photo for all these moving leaves and branches. Let's move on to our last image. This one should be quick because it's a single exposure. You can see pretty much did basic adjustments, dodging and burning, a little bit of the color, and then reframed it a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. So that looks pretty good. There's not a lot to be done to this one. We're going to reframe and crop it just above this little rock over here. And I composed it already in a rule of thirds with this falling on the line. So there's nothing as far as cropping on the sides. I just cropped the bottom and cropped the top, I think, just a little bit to the top of that tree. We're going to bring this into Photoshop for the dodging and burning, object removal, Orton effect, and any little things that we need to do here. I'm going to go ahead and crop it first, just so I know what I need to work on and what I don't. And I believe this one actually is a 4:5 crop for Instagram. So I would probably have it something like right there. Doesn't look like I removed too much, so I'm just going to go ahead and do the dodging and burning and the Orton blur. So in this image, the leading line is obviously the river over here, leading up to the waterfall. There's a little bit of obscured part of the river here, but it couldn't be helped because there's a lot of water vapor. I would have liked if there was a line, a white water line that leads all the way. As you can see, it's pretty much white water, and then the line starts over here. But these rocks kind of lead you the way, and your eye kind of knows where to go. I could possibly create some artificial white lines here, but don't feel like doing it for the tutorial. So that's good for the dodging and burning. Just gonna add the Orton blur, just a little bit on the waterfall, a little bit on the water. And this was a cloudy day, so I don't think it would work to create the fake sun. I might try it in Lightroom, see what it looks like. But for now, let's just merge these layers and create that final Orton blur layer. So that's looking pretty good. I added a little bit to the sky and then pulled back the opacity a little bit on the whole thing because I didn't want to overdo it. That's good for the Photoshop edits here. Gonna merge all that, save, and bring it back into Lightroom. So let's take a quick look at our base image. You can see it's pretty much just a little bit of contrast. The framing is slightly different. It's a little bit bluer, looks like. I'm not sure if that was done with split toning, but let's do some of these final adjustments and then we'll see what we come out with here. Okay, so I added the vignette, added that little fake sun up here. Not sure that it adds too much to it, but just, you know, just for kicks. It's pretty contrasty. I don't know if it might be too contrasty. I desaturated the greens a little bit because they were looking kind of unrealistic. Looks like this one is a little bit more red over here and a little bit more blue in the sky, but that's because I did a different split toning on this. Final thing would just be add the sharpening. And you pretty much have your image right here. So as you can see with a single shot, it's a lot less editing. We still do the dodging and burning, Orton blur, just different things to draw your attention to the right part of the image. But some photos are easier to edit and some require a little bit more work. So I hope you learned something from this tutorial. If you have any comments or questions, leave them in the comment section below. Be sure to check out my other tutorials, photography guides, travel guides, all my travel content on my channel. Be sure to like and subscribe for more, and I will see you on the next one.